before we get started today, I'm going to say it's really exciting to have the Placid Lassie, a D-Day veteran, in the hangar here, and I hope you all stay and take a look at her. She's beautiful. But it's even more exciting to have another World War II veteran here today, an Iwo Jima veteran, and I'm really honored that my friend Tom Lemmy, known as Hollywood Tom, is here in the audience. And so probably a lot of you know that next week, the 19th, is the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima. And that's what Tom was doing 75 years ago. So let's all and if you get a chance, stay to see Placid Lassie, but also talk to Tom. And so I want to really thank you all for coming this morning. And I'm excited to tell you this story because it's a story that not a lot of people know too much about. And I myself didn't actually know that there were drones during World War II until pretty recently. So they're kind of a hot topic today, you know, whether it's your own personal drone that takes some great aerial photos, all the way up to a Reaper drone making very precise military strikes. Or maybe Amazon will be delivering all our packages by drone. But the history of drones actually goes back quite far. And I'm going to tell you why I started to research them. So it starts with another museum on the other side of the world called the South Pacific World War II Museum that's in the island country of Vanuatu. And I'm fortunate enough to be involved with that museum doing research and writing for them. And I'm especially fortunate to be known as one of their dog tag sleuths. So Vanuatu was called the New Hebrides during World War II, so maybe that's a more familiar name. And it was a huge base, huge American base. There was never any fighting there, but there was huge Navy and air bases there, and many, many thousands of men and women were stationed there and passed through during World War II. Well, as that happens, people drop things, lose things, and even today, dog tags regularly turn up on the island and are turned over to the museum with the hope of finding the family and being able to send those tags home back to a family member. So they contacted me and said they had another one, and could I give them a hand with it? And so it thankfully had an unusual name, Francis Aloysius Mahan, and I could tell from the tag he was a naval officer. And just to go back here to give you an idea where we're talking about, here's Vanuatu, and here's Australia, New Guinea, and New Zealand. And so a lot of people passed through and frankly didn't do very many interesting things during World War II. So I was not necessarily expecting the owner of this tag to have an amazing story. But in fact, that's just what happened. So when I looked up Francis Aloysius Mahan, right away I saw that he was an interesting person. He had passed away in 1983, and there was even a large obituary in his hometown newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he'd owned a prominent historic house called Harriton in the town of Bryn Mawr. But the most interesting part was it says he was radio communications officer in a naval group called Special Task Air Group 1, Stag-1, the first guided missile project, using unmanned aircraft packed with high explosives and guided to targets by radio control. And so this was pretty surprising to see. I myself had only recently learned about this unit when I was visiting that area of the South Pacific. So it was really amazing to now find somebody who would serve with that unit, and a great reason to do some more research. So I called up Harriton House, and found a wonderful surprise. The curator and director of the museum is a man named Bruce Cooper Gill, and he's been in that position since it became a museum, and he knew Frank Mahan very well. And he said to me, oh, yes, I know about his naval service, and in fact, he had a scrapbook full of photographs that he took from the war, and a couple of reels of film that he shot himself. And Bruce said to me, you can come down and see those photos and look at that film. And he said, but we looked at the film years ago, and honestly, it wasn't too interesting. I just remembered a bunch of guys in sailboats. So I thought, all right, well, that's interesting. And, kind of forgot about that detail. But went on to learn about Frank Mahan, and he was born in Philadelphia in 1907, graduated from Villanova University, and became a banker. And he married a very beautiful woman, Alice Reed. You can see Frank and Alice here make a beautiful couple. And she was actually a model, was even a Chesterfield girl in the old advertisements for Chesterfield cigarettes. Well, even though Frank was a bit older and really didn't have to serve, he wanted to do his part for World War II, and he enlisted in the Navy in December of 1942. And because of his education, he was made an officer right away and sent to Harvard for communications training at the Naval Training School there. And he was assigned to a very interesting group, Special Task Air Group 1, or STAG-1, as their aircraft radio communications equipment officer. So I'm going to back up and tell you a little bit about drones before World War II, because it turns out they have quite a long history that goes back to just about as long as people have been able to fly. They've also been looking at ways to operate aircraft remotely. And in 1917, Dayton Wright Airplane Company built a aerial torpedo called the Kettering Bug. And it didn't see action in World War I, but it was kind of the first operable drone that we had. And there's a reproduction that you can even see today at the Air Force Museum in Dayton. Well, by 1935, the British had developed a radio-controlled drone. The name drone didn't exist. A radio-controlled plane. They changed a de Havilland biplane to be remotely operated, and they called their plane the Queen Bee. And here's the Queen Bee here. Well, not to be outdone, the U.S. got into the act, and in 1936, the Navy tasked Lieutenant Commander Delmar S. Varney with leading the Navy's unmanned aircraft program. And right away, they modified Curtiss and Stearman biplanes to fly by radio control. And it was Lieutenant Commander Varney who coined the term drone. The British had the Queen Bee, and we had the drone, the worker bee. So that's the origin of why we call them drones. And the other thing that Lieutenant Commander Varney did was to start a collaboration with a scientist at RCA called Dr. Vladimir Zworykin to use a new technology that they just developed called television. So this was a really amazing leap forward, as you'll see. So there were several drone projects during World War II, and I'll just tell you very briefly about the one that we're not going to focus on. And it was called Project Aphrodite in the Army Air Forces and Project Anvil in the US Navy. And here the idea was to take old bombers that were kind of worn out, had flown a lot of missions, they're now beyond their lifespan, and pack them full of explosives, namely Torpex, which was more explosive than TNT, and to turn them into unmanned guided missiles. And so there would be a manned takeoff, and then they would turn over control by radio to another plane, and then the crew would parachute out. And they actually did fly 15 missions in the European theater from August of 1944 to January of 1945. And you might have heard of this because in one of those August 1944 missions, a pretty prominent person was killed, Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., so the older son of John F. Kennedy and the older brother of John F. Kennedy and the oldest son of the Kennedy clan. And a lot of people think that had he survived the war, he was being groomed to be president. So it's interesting to think about how history might have been different if this particular flight had not gone awry, and sadly the plane exploded before the crew could bail out. So the Navy had a couple of drones themselves, and they started their own project, Project Option, in February 1942. And the idea was to develop an assault drone that could deliver a bomb. And it started off with the Tdr-1. And you can see the Tdr-1. It flew in late 1942. It was twin engine, built by Naval Aircraft Factory. And you can see it had these kind of cumbersome tricycle landing gear. And it did fly, and it even took off from carriers, but it was used for target practice, for aerial gunnery practice. So they then went on to perfect the design and came up with the Tdr-1 drone, which was the next design. It finally flew in the latter part of 1943, and this was the plane that was assigned to Special Task Air Group 1. So let me tell you a bit about the Tdr-1 drone. It was built by Interstate Aircraft and Engineering Corporation of El Segundo, California. You can see it here. It had a 48-foot wingspan, 30 feet long, was pretty lightweight at 2,700 pounds, powered by two Lycoming 220 horsepower engines. But the interesting thing about this plane is its construction. So they knew that it was likely going on a one-way mission. So there was no sense in wasting valuable resources in this plane. So they wanted to make it as expendable as possible. And it had a tubular steel frame. Well, the company that they chose to make that frame was very well equipped to do it. It was the Schwinn Bicycle Company. And then the skin of the plane, didn't want to waste precious aluminum on that. They wanted a wooden frame and a wooden skin. And they turned to another company that was very good at making a molded, curved pieces of wood. And that was the Wurlitzer Organ Company of DeKalb, Illinois. And so, they were used to forming pressed plywood into intricate shapes of their organs and pianos and their jukeboxes. So I kind of think it's ironic that the men who ultimately were flying this plane had before been jitterbugging around their jukeboxes. And it's really an amazing feat of American manufacturing, as FDR called the arsenal of democracy, that Wurlitzer was able to completely retool their factory to build these planes. They completely stopped producing everything else and focused on the parts of these planes. Interstate then built a factory of its own right across from Wurlitzer, Oregon, so that they could put everything together. Now this plane had a cockpit, and it could be flown like a conventional plane with a pilot. The interesting thing was the workers who were putting this plane together had no idea that they were building a secret unmanned vehicle. They thought it was a regular lightweight airplane. So really it was a secret even to those working on the project. So the plane had landing gear that could be jettisoned along the way. It didn't need to come back and land. It had a range of 425 miles one way, and most of its flights in combat were thought to be one way. Wasn't too fast, maximum speed of 140 miles per hour, and they built just about 200 of them. So you can see here's a field with a whole bunch of them. They're in the piloted configuration, and takeoff and landing, if it was to be done remotely, would be done by an operator, pilot on the ground. Once it was airborne, it would be flown by a radio control by a pilot in a control plane. But the really unique part of this aircraft was the fact that an RCA television camera was placed in the nose of the plane, and it transmitted to a screen in the control plane so that the drone pilot could watch what was happening on this TV. So I'll show you a few pictures of it. Here's one. It's also in the piloted configuration. You can see he's there behind the prop, and it's got the landing gear, so clearly going to land. And you can see this hole here in the nose would be where the camera would be. And a bottom view, see they would carry a 2,000-pound bomb or several smaller bombs. This one still has the landing gear, but now here's one that's completely ready for an attack. It's lost its landing gear, and it's fully armed. And here's one of the few shots that exist that shows the plane in the field. It's being armed here by the ground crew, but the nose is off, and you can see that television camera in the nose. And that was really an amazing feat of technology at the time. When those cameras started out, they were huge. They were about 600 pounds, so much too heavy. Through the efforts of doctors working at RCA, finally got it down to about 90 pounds. So really reduced that significantly to be able to fit it in the nose of the plane. So very significant achievement. So the control plane was a modified Grumman General Motors built TDR-1 Sea Avenger torpedo bomber. And the drone was controlled by a pilot sitting in the belly of the plane here, using a joystick, which was a new invention. We didn't have them like we do today on video games, but it was just like that. And oddly enough, a telephone dial, so a regular old-fashioned rotary telephone dial, and that they could dial in an altitude using that very analog system. And it also had down there for the drone pilot to see a 5-inch television screen to watch the view from the nose of the drone. Interestingly, it also had a camera inside, a movie camera, that was recording what was being shown on the TV screen. And that's pretty interesting because those movies still exist today. So we can see what the drone pilot was seeing on his television screen. And you can see this isn't a normal part of a TBM Avenger. So this dome would be extended or retracted, and it housed the radio and television receiver transmitter antenna below the fuselage. And there was still the normal crew of 3 of pilot, gunner, and radio operator in the TBM, as well as the drone pilot down below. And the drone could fly about 6 to 8 miles from the drone, from the TBM. And so it didn't even need to be within sight of the drone. So Stag-1 was commissioned in August of 1943. It jumped around a bit, started off at the Naval Air Station in Clinton, Oklahoma, ended up at Traverse City, Michigan, and then at Monterey, California for training. And they trained quite extensively. They received the aircraft in January of 1944, and by May, they finally had their orders to go into the field. And the planes were transported to the South Pacific by this aircraft carrier, the USS Marcus Island. And it's hard to see, but these planes on the back with their tails sticking up are the Tdr One drones. And up front, are the TBM Avenger control planes with their wings folded. So they were transported to the South Pacific along with the entire crew of the Stag-1 group. And they arrived at an island called Benica in the Russell's group of the Solomon Islands. So this is a little bit north of Guadalcanal. Well, by now, summer of 1944, this is completely rear area. There's no more fighting in this area. And Benica was a very large base and had a couple of large airfields on it. So it was a good place for them to do some additional training. And they broke up into 2 squadrons of pilots. And amongst the photographs that Frank Mahan had in his personal scrapbook was photos of the pilots. And this is a group of 1 squadron, which was named VK-11. And they're all standing behind one of the TBMs. And these men were pilots of the drones as well as the TBM Avengers. So the drone pilots were regular pilots. They weren't, they had gone through the same regular pilot training that everyone would have, plus additional training to fly the drones. And then the second squadron was VK-12, and again, drone and TBM pilots. And the nice thing about this in Frank's collection was that there was a key with the names of all of these men, which I don't think I was able to find anywhere else. So I'm hoping to pass this information on to people who are interested that maybe had a relative who served in the squadron and might be able to be excited to see their relative in one of these photos. So they got right to work flying practice missions from Benica and started on June 20th. And on July 30th of 1944, they flew their first practice strike. So before that, it was just take off, control the plane, land the plane. So now they had a simulated combat mission where they were striking a beached Japanese freighter called the Yamazuki Maru, which was beached near Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal. So it made a good target. And the best thing about this was they filmed this practice in both in color and black and white. And we'll watch that mission. And so they had several planes. This had been, so this is the first drone taking off. This is on Sunlight Field on Benica. Second one didn't do too well. Third one looks better, and that's 873. I'm going to mention that particular plane again, so keep it in mind.
It's not landing gear, it's takeoff gear.
Last one, taken off. So now this is Guadalcanal. That's Cape Esperance. And you can see the ship is there and the plane. Direct hit, so very good. Next one will be coming in. And this one just misses, but close, very close. That, and I'm going to mention that was plane 873. Remember that one. Go to the water, but it's still a good job. on. So another direct hit. So, 50%, that's really not bad. So the Stag-1 group is really excited with these results, and their commanding officer, Commander T.W. South, takes the film to Pearl Harbor, goes back, he's all excited, takes the film there, show everybody, the higher-ups, what a great job they're doing, and he can't believe it when he said, well, when he hears them say, that's nice, but we decided to cancel your project. And he's crushed, and he argues with them, said, we're already there, we got the planes there, we're all trained up, why can't you just let us run some combat missions? And they said, okay, we'll give you'll have a month to do some combat missions. So he came back then, and the Stag-1 group did fly combat missions from 27th September 1944 up until, for about a month, up until October 26th. They flew their first mission against Kahili Airfield, which was on the southern tip of Bougainville, which was still occupied by the Japanese, even though we ourselves had occupied further north of Bougainville. And there were missions against Balai, Raval, Bougainville, New Ireland. So these were all still Japanese bases, but they'd kind of been cut off. And so we're not a huge threat anymore, but there were still regular bombing runs to try to further neutralize them. So these TDR-1 strikes certainly helped in the effort. They flew the combat missions not from Vanica, where they were stationed, but a little further north, Sterling Island, and then further north still, Green or Nissen Island, which is north of Bougainville. Part of the reason they did that is they were getting interference, radio interference from our own installations as they would fly past them, and it was causing them to go off course, so they ended up flying north of our air bases to avoid that. And the Japanese were not expecting this. They saw these planes that were crashing into things, and they didn't know that there was no pilot. They thought they were American kamikazes and didn't know that they were flying remotely controlled. Eventually they figured it out, though, because enough of them crashed without exploding that the Japanese were able to see what was coming at them. So they had mixed results. One record says 45% direct hits. My calculation is a little bit lower, but still pretty good. And in fact, can see this top secret list of combat operations, and it lists each strike and how many drones and the pilots. And generally, it was pretty good. It didn't make a huge difference, but it certainly proved the worth of the technology. And the group itself, the people in the group were very, very proud of it, as they should have been. And in fact, years later, even one of the higher up officers in the organization was just very, very proud of the fact that there had been no men killed in action, missing in action, taken prisoner of war. There weren't any injuries or loss of control crafts on these combat missions. Which is pretty impressive, and I think definitely showed that it was potentially very useful. But the Navy felt otherwise and said, sorry, we gave you your month and thanks, but that's it. So when I was looking closely at the squadron records, after seeing in several different places about no loss of pilots, I was kind of surprised to look at the war diary from September and see that for several days, September 5th of 1944 to 6th, 7th, and 8th, there weren't any practice flights flown. This was before they started flying combat. And it says, no control flights, planes were utilized in search for 3 missing pilots. I thought, well, that's interesting, but there were still a lot of other units flying from Benica and the surrounding islands. I figured that the control planes were probably just helping out in a search for maybe some fighter pilots or, a lost bomber, something like that. So I was surprised then to come across a war diary of a ship, the USS APC-26, which noted that from September 8th up until September 14th, they were sailing out of Russell Sound, the Reynard Sound, the Russell Islands, which is Benica, along with another small attack ship, APC-30. Our mission is to search for 3 missing men of Special Task Air Group 1, lost in a sailboat off Tonalau Island, Russell Islands. Well, they searched for several days, so the men of the squadron and their planes had searched beginning the 5th, so 9 days of looking by air and sea, and these pilots weren't found. So it turns out there are missing in action pilots from this group, but they're not missing in action from combat. They're missing in action because they were sailing in a small sailboat. And here's Benica Island, and you can see it's part of a cluster of islands. This one, big one here, is called Pavuvu, which, if you've ever read about the Pacific War, has a bad reputation amongst the men who had to stay there before and after various battles. It was not a very hospitable environment. You can see there's all these tiny little islands, all these coves and inlets here, and it must have been fun, but also pretty dangerous to be sailing around in these parts and not know exactly where you were. Well, reading this reminded me of something that Bruce Gill, back at Harrington House, the historic house that Frank Mahan had owned, said. He said, oh, there were some films that Frank shot. It was just men in sailboats, though. So those became a lot more interesting to me suddenly, and I did go down to Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, to take a look, and Bruce was kind enough to let me borrow all of Frank Mahan's photographs and his films and have them digitized. And so, Frank, he didn't try to take anything top secret. He knew better than that. So there's a lot of pictures of his friends and men and recreation, which apparently a big one was sailing. And this picture, we're not sure if this was taken in the Russell Islands or potentially in the New Hebrides and Espiritu Santo, but we think it's the Russell Islands. And here's Frank and a buddy in the sailboat. And I'll just show you a little bit of Frank's digitized film. Not terribly earth-shattering, but interesting. You'll see there are quite a few sailboats there, and looks very peaceful and a fun way to spend some time, but in fact ended up proving deadly for 3 of the men. And I think it's just interesting to remember that even though they weren't in the combat, this is my favorite part. There we go. Even though they weren't in combat, they were halfway around the world, environment they didn't know. There were lots of dangers, and anything could happen, from all the different diseases to something like this. So sadly, these 3 men were lost, and certainly in a way that wouldn't have happened to them if they had stayed at home. So, and this, I think, this is additional film. I believe this was taken on Saipan, but we're not going to watch all of this. Go ahead. So then the mystery to me was, well, who were these 3 missing pilots? Because it wasn't listed anywhere in the squadron documentation that they'd lost anybody at all, and it wasn't listed who. So I really wanted to find out who were the men who had disappeared. And by using resources available at the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, I was able to figure out 3 people who had gone missing on that day, September 4th of 1944, and they weren't listed as being part of Stag-1, but eventually I was able to pinpoint it to these 3 people. And then when I looked at Frank Mahan's labeled photograph of the pilots in Stag-1, I saw that they were all in the VK-11 squadron. In fact, one of them was the squadron's skipper, his commanding officer here, Lieutenant Julian M. Johnston. Another one was Lieutenant Junior Grade Frank L. Herbert, and the third one was Lieutenant Junior Grade John L. Barnes. So, of course, I was pretty curious to find out more about them and see what I could find. And so here's Lieutenant Junior Grade Barnes from Amarillo, Texas. Lieutenant Julian M. Johnston, commanding officer, he was originally from Chicago. By this point, he was already married and had 2 small children, and they were living in Clinton, Oklahoma, where the group had been in training. And then Lieutenant Junior Grade Frank Herbert from Miami, Florida. And I obtained service records for John Barnes, kind of curious to see what was officially documented as far as what happened to them. And you can see he was reported missing September 4th, 1944, on authorized liberty when the boat he was sailing in was lost in the vicinity of the Russell Islands group, Solomon Islands. And so he and the other 2 men were declared dead a year and a day after their disappearance. So their families were notified about what had happened to them and that it was not combat related, but it was considered not negligence or anything on their, they were on official leave and could do what they, just what they were doing. So they weren't doing anything wrong. Sadly, it just didn't turn out to be more dangerous and probably current that they weren't expecting maybe swept them out to sea. And having been in that area myself in a much larger boat, I can attest to the fact that there's some rough waters around there. So I could imagine that things maybe got overwhelming pretty quickly for such a small sailboat. So I'm going to mention Lieutenant Junior Grade Barnes a little bit more because it turns out he's one of our own, a New Yorker. He started off being born in Binghamton, New York, in November 30th, 1921. His family moved to Amarillo, Texas in 1924, but we'll still claim him as a New Yorker. And he enlisted in the Navy right after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And he became an aviation cadet in June of 1942. And it was not easy, especially earlier in the war, to become an aviation cadet. That was kind of one of the highest things you could do. And so you had to have an application and apply, show that you were really superior in every way to become a naval aviator. And he did that. And so this photo comes from his application to be a naval aviator. And I just had to include this little letter. So to have this application, you had to have people from home write a letter of recommendation on your behalf. And you had to write your own statement on why and what would make you a good candidate. And I just thought this was really poignant. He's talking about he's very young, he's never had a steady job. He spent several summers helping. I helped my dad in his business or worked for short times at odd jobs. But then he says, I did though have a paper route, which I carried for a couple of years while going to junior college. And he's clearly very proud of that, having a paper route. And it's kind of, it's kind of sad that to remember that these were kids and they were just kids, jobs like having a paper route. And then the next thing, a few months later, they were training to be pilots or to be storming the beaches at Iwo Jima. So it's good to remember that fact that just how young they all were. So I also noticed something interesting then when I was looking more closely at the combat records of the squadron. There was that table on the other slide that listed all the different strikes that they flew. Well, here's the Yamazuki Maru, the practice strike that we watched the film for, and tail number 873, so that's the one we watched take off okay, and flew a little bit high and missed the target. Well, this was the drone pilot for that plane, and it was Barnes. It was Lieutenant John Barnes flying that plane. So he, along with the other two missing men, are memorialized in the American Cemetery in Manila on the tablets of the missing, and you can see his name here, Barnes, John L., Lieutenant, junior grade, U.S. Naval Reserve, Texas, and Lieutenant Johnston and Lieutenant J.G. Herbert are also there. So after their combat missions were over, and the higher up brass had said, that's it, the Stag 1 group disbanded. And the planes, unbelievably, I've read that the Avenger control planes were dumped in the channel in Benica. I'm not sure if that's all of them, but people were pretty disappointed about that. The drones themselves were either dumped or more likely they were used for target practice. So kind of met and somewhat useful end, but not what the rest of the squadron had been hoping for. So all the personnel associated with the group were reassigned to new positions, and the pilots would have been reassigned to regular torpedo bombing squadrons, and at least some of them did go to serve then on aircraft carriers. And this is another photo of Frank Mahan's. He's sitting here. And so, of course, there were many more people than just the pilots. There was all the ground crew and intelligence and everybody else who was needed to make the whole project run. And they all had to be reassigned as well. Well, for Frank, he still had some interesting times left ahead of him. So after the squadron disbanded, he was assigned to the island of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, or Vanuatu today. And he served there from December of 1944 until April of 1945. And he was the field maintenance and communications officer for Palaculo Airfield, or also known as Bomber Number 1. And so this was a pretty important role for him. And I have to just point out, I can't resist pointing out that at the same time he was stationed there, there was another naval lieutenant stationed there who was also from the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. And he was also born in 1907 and had kind of a similar educational background to Frank. And his name was Lieutenant James A. Michener. And you may have heard of him because one of the things he was doing while he was stationed on that island was writing Tales of the South Pacific, which later became the Broadway musical South Pacific. So I have to wonder if they crossed paths, and I think it's very likely they did. So it's interesting for me to think about whether the two of them got together sometimes and reminisced about Philadelphia. And so kind of a neat coincidence. Well, Frank wasn't done then. He was later transferred to Saipan, to Kobler Field from April 1945 until the end of the war, until September. And he served as field operations officer and later camp officer. After the war had ended, he was in charge of camp for people passing through there, being sent home. And so he had a brush with another interesting secret project, of course, the atomic bombs. So the B-29s that were carrying the atomic bombs, so Enola Gay and Boxcar, they took off from Tinian Island, which you can easily see from Saipan, in August of 1945. And so I have to wonder if Frank knew what was happening those months he was on Saipan, what was happening across the channel a few miles away on Tinian. And in fact, here's Frank on Saipan, and you can see there's a B-29 flying above him, and very well could have a plane taking off or landing at Tinian. So the war did end, and Frank safely returned home in October of 1945. And I'll just point out a couple more photos from his collection. He's kind of has an Ernest Hemingway look by now, and obviously he's having a pretty good time. He's got his buddies. They've got a little dog, so kind of paints a picture of him having an exciting time. And he came home then. He came home to Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, and his wife Alice. And he came home back to his job at the bank as a loan manager, which kind of reminds me of the movie The Best Years of Our Lives. The Frederick March character had the same job, and it was kind of a letdown for the character in the movie to come after serving, to come back to the kind of monotony of his job. Well, I think maybe it was the same for Frank. And he eventually went into real estate, and he purchased this beautiful historic house, Harriton House, which was the first building in Bryn Mawr. In fact, the house at that point was called Bryn Mawr, and so dates to 1704. And Frank tried to stay in the Naval Reserves, but he was discharged. He just wasn't really fit enough to stay in. And his health began to decline. Unfortunately, he was also turned out to be part of a not very happy marriage. While they were still living at Harriton House, the town recognized the importance of the structure as being a historic monument that really needed to be preserved, and actually took over their house and began to turn it into a museum. Frank and Alice moved to an outbuilding, which was still quite nice, but they moved in there and lived out the rest of their years on the property, but no longer in this house. Well, at that point, as it was turning into a museum, that's when Bruce Cooper Gill came aboard to lead the project, and that's how he got to know Frank. And he just said, every day, Frank would come, and anybody who would listen, Frank would love to tell about his exploits during World War II and the secret project that he worked on. I think he knew by then he could let the secret out, and it was okay. So Frank passed away then in 1983. Alice passed in 1996. At that point, the contents of their house were dispersed, sold off, but the curator, Bruce, had the foresight to hang on to Frank's photo album and his films. So I was really happy about that. So that leads to kind of an interesting end to the story, though. The story about the dog tags being on the island in Vanuatu. So when I came back, after I'd done all this research, I came back to the manager of the museum. His name was Alma Wency. And I said, well, okay, I figured it out. Unfortunately, Frank and Alice never had children. I really wasn't able to find any close family members for them to return the dog tags to. And Alma came back to me and said something like, I looked at them again, and I made a mistake. They weren't found on the island. Nobody turned them in. We acquired them on eBay. And so the museum is just starting up building their collections and exhibits, and they bought a bunch of items of just good examples of different gear that would have been used in World War II in the Pacific. So they randomly, it turns out, bought this set of dog tags from Stewart's Military Antiques, Mesa, Arizona, and along with a few other relics to put on display. They didn't have any idea that they belonged to an officer who'd served on Vanuatu and Espiritu Santo, and especially not in such a prominent role. So it was an unbelievable coincidence then that these tags that belonged to somebody who served on the island, and now they're back on the island. And so it just kind of reminds me of that, the incredible journey story about dogs who find their way home for thousands of miles. Well, it seemed like it was happening with dog tags here. And so these tags, Frank wore them from Espiritu Santo to Saipan, and in fact, Bruce was able to explain he wore them all the way back to Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. After he and Alice passed, their items, including his uniform and tags, were sold off to collectors. Years later, 20-some years later now, the museum on Espiritu Santo has bought these tags and brought them back. And we all decided that that was the place where Frank was happiest, and that he would want his tags to be back where he served, where he felt like he was doing important work. And so the tags are going to stay at the museum on Espiritu Santo and be part of a display that talks about Frank and the secret drone project. So I'll just say very briefly, there's just one last drone in existence. It's at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola 3. In Pensacola, it's painted as Edna 3. So that one that we saw getting fitted with the bomb. So you can see that today. And I want to stop here. I want to thank my colleagues at the South Pacific World War II Museum. I recommend you take a look at their website. It's fantastic. Especially want to thank Alma Wensi, who very, very sadly passed away unexpectedly last year. And then I want to acknowledge Kevin McCarthy, a New Zealander, Ali Cobb, an American, who's a graduate student at Clemson University, and Jimmy Carter, an Australian, for all working with me on this project. And Harrington House, if you're in Bryn Mawr, go check it out and meet Bruce Cooper Gill. I'm going to thank him. And then also the National Archives, PBS History Detectives had an episode on Stag-1. There's a great website, stag1.org. And I also want to mention a historian, Henry Sakita, who was probably the first person to do any research on this unit. And it's in his book, The Siege of Rabaul. And I was very honored to know him. And sadly, he too unexpectedly passed away. And so very grateful to him for his research and also his mentorship with me. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope, thank you for listening all this time.